Good afternoon. Welcome to Darien Library. My name is Erin Shea, and I'm the head of adult programming here at the library. I'd like to just mention briefly that programs at Darien Library are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign. So thank you so much for your continued support to make programs like these and our collections available to the community. I'd also like to give a very special thank you to Barrett Bookstore here in town, and in particular Susan and Sheila and Rosanna, because they were the entire impetus in having our guest here today. So thank you. Speaking of our guest, he is the author of the Bascom novels, which include The Sports Writer and its sequels, Independence Day, the first novel to win the Pulitzer Prize and the PEN/Faulkner Award, and The Lay of the Land, as well as the short story collections Rock Springs and A Multitude of Sins, which contain many widely anthologized stories. He lives in East Boothbay, Maine, with his wife, Christina, who is here tonight as well. He is here to discuss his latest novel, though, which is called Canada. It is a powerful, suspenseful story of misadventure and malevolence that explores large themes of identity, culpability, and the ineluctable bonds that tie us to the past. I am so very honored to welcome to Darien Library this afternoon, Mr. Richard Ford.
Thank you, Erin, very much. Thank you all for coming. I must say I sold you all short. I thought that the day after a big blizzard, you would all be shoveling out today. But thank you in particular for coming on the day after the blizzard. Christina and I are really happy to be here. Thanks to the Barrett Bookstore for asking me to come. It's a great honor. And I have to tell you, to have the library open on Sunday, that's just spectacular. I can't tell you how impressed I am. And what that means to me, of course, is not just that you all have nothing else to do, but that you value books and that you value the library, and that you know that a public institution like this is useful to you and a great piece of luck. I mean, you know, libraries are where children can come and be safe. And even if you think that your children are safe here, libraries all over the country are those kinds of places. Christina and I have lived in places where the library was open one day a week in Dutton, Montana. And where we live now in East Boothbay, Maine, the library is open randomly. You can almost never know when the library is going to be open. But it's a place where kids can come, and adults too, obviously, and not be constrained by the kinds of thought police and conventional wisdoms that constrain kids all the time. So it is such a great resource to have this place. And the bookstore as well. I mean, the bookstore and the library are hand in hand in this effort, and I'm just honored to be part of it. I am a child of the library in Jackson, Mississippi, what is now the Eudora Welty Library. My mother, we didn't have air conditioning in the 40s and 50s in Mississippi. So my mother, and we did have air conditioning in the library. And it was very hot, and my mother would take me to the library and just leave me there at age 8. It was in the library that I received my first bad review. That somebody wrote on the walls of the boys' room that Richard Ford has the nastiest mind of anybody in Jackson, Mississippi. And then, I always hate to tell this, but then I have to tell it too, because it's only fair. They used to, in Jackson where I lived and grew up, my mother would dump me in the library and leave, because I was an only child, and she was saddled with basically being a single parent because my father traveled. She was saddled with raising an only child, and she would leave me there. And there was a man there named Mr. Hewitt who was the rare books librarian. I don't know what rare books they might have had. But he would come up behind me where I was sitting looking at books, and he would come up behind me and put his hand on the back of my head, and he would reach down and kiss me on the back of my head. Well, I knew that was unusual, and so I would go home and I would say to my mother, you know, Mr. Hewitt, who was the single older brother of a very important man in the newspaper. He was gay, I'm sure, but that was not part of the parlance then. My mother would say, oh, for God's sake, she would say, tell him to cut that out. Now, of course, Mr. Hewitt would be dragged through the streets. But there was a way to deal with things then that weren't menacing, but would be seen as menacing now. I hope our, well, Christina and I aren't parents, so I hope parents have a sense of balance about these things. Anyway, thanks for coming. Canada is a novel that I started writing in 1989, and then because I shouldn't have been trying to start anything in 1989, discontinued writing after about a week, and took with my 11 pages and I stuck them in the freezer compartment of our refrigerator and left them there for 20 years. And occasionally, actually over the 20 years, to the tune of about 365, I would put notes into this envelope that I kept in the freezer with my 11 pages of 11 pages handwritten, 20 pages typewritten, beginning of a story that I had written, and I would just put pages, notes, scraps in there. And so after all of these years went by and I was in the process of changing publishers from Knopf to HarperCollins, I proposed to write a novel, having never looked at anything in that envelope since 1989, and this was 2008. I proposed to write a novel called Canada, and so then I took out all of my 300 plus notes and put them all together to see if I could write something based on those notes. And this novel is what basically emerged from that effort. What I'm going to do is just read to you the beginning of it, which is and if you can't make the beginning of a novel make sense, you probably are in the wrong line of work. I don't like reading parts where I have to do all this blah, 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 explaining who is whom, put you to sleep. And after that, I'll be happy to answer questions if anybody has any. First, I'll tell about the robbery our parents committed, then about the murders, which happened later. The robbery is the more important part since it served to set my and my sister's lives on the courses they eventually followed. Nothing would make complete sense without that being told first. Our parents were the least likely two people in the world to rob a bank. They weren't strange people, not obviously criminals. No one would have thought they were destined to end up the way they did. They were just regular, although, of course, that kind of thinking became null and void the moment they did rob a bank. My father, Bev Parsons, was a country boy born in Marengo County, Alabama in 1923 and came out of high school in 1939, burning to be in the Army Air Corps, the branch that became the Air Force. He went in at Demopolis, trained at Randolph near San Antonio, longed to be a fighter pilot, but lacked the aptitude, and so learned bombardiering instead. He flew the B-25s, the light-medium Mitchells that were seeing duty in the Philippines and later over Osaka, where they rained destruction on the earth, both on the enemy and undeserving people alike. He was a tall, winning, smiling, handsome six-footer. He barely fitted into his bombardier's compartment with a big, square, expectant face and knobby cheekbones and sensuous lips and long, attractive feminine eyelashes. He had white, shiny teeth and short black hair he was proud of, as he was of his name, Bev. Captain Bev Parsons. He never conceded that Beverly was a woman's name in most people's minds. It grew from Anglo-Saxon roots, he said. It's a common name in England. Vivian, Gwen, and Shirley are men's names there. No one confuses them with women. He was a nonstop talker, was open-minded for a Southerner, had graceful, obliging manners that should have taken him far in the Air Force, but didn't. His quick hazel eyes would search around any room he was in, finding someone to pay attention to him, my sister and me, ordinarily. He told corny jokes in a southern theatrical style, could do card tricks and magic tricks, could detach his thumb and replace it, make a handkerchief disappear and come back. He could play boogie-woogie piano and would sometimes talk Dixie to us, and sometimes like Amos and Andy. He had lost some of his hearing by flying the Mitchells and was sensitive about it, but he looked sharp in his honest GI haircut and blue captain's tunic, and generally conveyed a warmth that was genuine and made my twin sister and me love him. It was also probably the reason my mother had been attracted to him, though they couldn't have been more unsuited and different, and unluckily gotten pregnant from their one hasty encounter after meeting at a party honoring returned airmen near where he was retraining to learn supply officer duties at Fort Lewis in March 1945, when no one needed him to drop bombs anymore. They were married immediately when they found out. Her parents, who lived in Tacoma, were Jewish immigrants from Poland and didn't approve. They were educated mathematics teachers and semi-professional musicians and popular concertizers in Poznan who'd escaped after 1918 and come to Washington State through Canada and became, of all things, school custodians. Being Jews meant little to them by then, or to our mother. Just an old, exacting, constricted conception of life they were happy to put behind them in a land where there apparently were no Jews. But for their only daughter to marry a smiling, talkative, only son of Scotch-Irish, Alabama backwoods timber estimators was never in their thinking. And they soon put it out of their thinking altogether. And while from a distance it may seem that our parents were merely not made for one another, it was more true that when our mother married our father, it betokened a loss, and her life changed forever, and not in a good way, as she surely must have believed. My mother, Neva Camper, short for Geneva, was a tiny, intense, bespectacled woman with unruly brown hair, downy vestiges of which ran down her jawline. She had thick eyebrows and a shiny, thin-skinned forehead under which her veins were visible, and a pale, indoor complexion that made her appear fragile, which she wasn't. My father jokingly said people where he was from in Alabama called her hair Jew hair or immigrant hair. But he liked it and loved her. She never seemed to pay these words much attention. She had small, delicate hands whose nails she kept manicured and shined and was vain about and gestured with absently. She owned a skeptical frame of mind, was an intent listener when we talked to her, and had a wit that could turn biting. She wore frameless glasses, read French poetry, often used terms like cauchemar or trou de colle, which my sister and I didn't understand. She wrote poems in brown ink, bought through the mail, and kept a journal we weren't permitted to read, and normally had a slightly nose-elevated, astigmatized expression of perplexity, which became true of her, and may always have been true. Before she married my father and quickly had my sister and me, she'd graduated at 18 from Whitman College in Walla Walla, had worked in a bookstore, featured herself possibly as a bohemian and a poet, and had hoped someday to land a job as a studious small college instructor, married to someone different from who she did marry, conceivably a college professor, which would have given her the life she believed she was intended for. She was only 34 in 1960, the year these events occurred, but she already had serious lines beside her nose, which was small and pinkish at its tip, and her large, penetrating gray-green eyes had dusky lids that made her seem foreign and slightly sad and dissatisfied, which she was. She possessed a pretty thin neck and a sudden, unexpected smile that showed off her small teeth and girlish, heart-shaped mouth, though it was a smile she rarely practiced, except on my sister and me. We realized she was an unusual-looking person, dressed as she typically was in olive-color slacks and baggy-sleeved cotton blouses and hemp and cotton shoes she must have sent away to the West Coast for, since you couldn't buy such things in Great Falls. And she only seemed more unusual, standing reluctantly beside our tall, handsome, outgoing father, though it was rarely the case that we went out as a family or ate in restaurants, so that we hardly noticed how they appeared in the world among strangers. To us, life in our house seemed normal. My sister and I could easily see why my mother would have been attracted to Bev Parsons, big, plank-shouldered, talkative, funny, forever wanting to please anybody who came in range. But it was never completely obvious why he would take an interest in her, tiny, barely 5 feet, inward and shy, alienated, artistic, pretty only when she smiled, and witty only when she felt completely comfortable. He must have somehow just appreciated all that, sensed she had a subtler mind than his, but that he could please her, which made him happy. It was to his good credit that he looked beyond their physical differences to the heart of things human, which I admired, even if it wasn't in our mother to notice. Still, the odd union of their mismatched physical attributes always plays in my mind as part of the reason they ended up badly. They were, no doubt, simply wrong for each other, and should never have married or done any of it, should have gone their separate ways after their first passionate encounter, no matter its outcome. The longer they stayed on, and the better they knew each other, the better she, at least, could see their mistake, and the more misguided their lives became, like a long proof in mathematics, in which the first calculation is wrong, following which all other calculations move you further away from how things were when they made sense. A sociologist of those times, the beginning of the 60s, might say our parents were in the vanguard of an historical moment, were among the first who transgressed society's boundaries, embraced rebellion, believed in credos requiring ratification through self-destruction, but they weren't. They weren't reckless people in the vanguard of anything. They were, as I said, regular people, tricked by circumstance and bad instincts, along with bad luck, to venture outside of boundaries they knew to be right, and then found themselves unable to go back. Though I'll say this about my father. When he returned from the theater of war and from being the agent of whistling death out of the skies, it was 1945, the year my sister and I were born, in Michigan at the Wurtsmith base in Oscoda, he may have been in the grip of some great unspecified gravity, as many GIs were. He spent the rest of his life wrestling with that gravity, puzzling to stay positive and afloat, making bad decisions that truly seemed good for a moment, but ultimately misunderstanding the world he'd returned home to, and having that misunderstanding become his life. Again, it must have been that way for millions of boys, although he would never have known it about himself or admitted it was true. Our family came to a stop in Great Falls, Montana in 1956, the way many military families came to where they came to following the war. We lived on air bases in Mississippi and California and Texas. Our mother had her degree and did substitute teaching in all those places. Our father hadn't been deployed to Korea, but been assigned to desk jobs at home in the supply and requisition forces. He'd been allowed to stay in because he'd won combat ribbons, but hadn't advanced beyond captain. And at a certain point, which happened when we were in Great Falls and he was 37, he decided the Air Force was no longer offering him much of a future, and having put in 20 years, he ought to take his pension and muster out. He felt our mother's lack of social interests and her unwillingness to invite anyone from the base to our house for dinner may have held him back, and possibly he was right. In truth, I think if there had been someone she admired, she might have liked it. but she never thought there would be. It's just cows and wheat out here, she said. There's no real organized society. In any case, I think our father was tired of the Air Force and liked Great Falls as a place where he thought he could get ahead, even without a social life. He said he hoped to join the Masons. It was by then the spring of 1960. My sister Berner and I were 15. We were enrolled in the Lewis for Meriwether Lewis Junior High, which was near enough to the Missouri River that from the tall school windows I could see the shining river surface and the ducks and birds congregated there, and could glimpse the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul depot where passenger trains no longer stopped, and up to the municipal airport on Gore Hill, where there were 2 flights a day, and down the river to the smelter stack and the oil refinery above the falls the city took its name from. I could even, on clear days, see the hazy, snowy peaks of the Eastern Front, 60 miles away, running south toward Idaho and north up to Canada. My sister and I had no idea about the West except what we saw on TV, or even, for that matter, about America itself, which we took for granted was the best place to be. Our real life was the family, and we were part of its loose baggage. And because of our mother's growing alienation, her reclusiveness, her feeling of superiority, and her desire that Berner and I not assimilate into the market town mentality which she believed stifled life in Great Falls, we didn't have a life like most children, which might have involved friends to visit, a paper route, scouts, and dances. If we fit in, our mother felt, it would only increase the chance we'd end up right where we were. It was also true that if your father was at the base, no matter where you lived, you always had few friends and rarely met your neighbors. We did everything at the base, visited the doctor, the dentist, got haircuts, shopped for groceries. People knew that. They knew you wouldn't be where you were for long, so why bother taking the trouble to know you? The base carried a stigma, as if things that went on there were what proper people didn't need to know about or be associated with. Plus, my mother being Jewish and having an immigrant look and being in some ways bohemian, it was something we all talked about, as if protecting America from its enemies wasn't decent. Still, at least in the beginning, I liked Great Falls. It was called the Electric City because the falls produced power. It seemed rough-edged and upright and remote, yet still was part of the limitless country we'd already lived in. I didn't much like it that the streets had only had numbers for names, which was confusing, and my mother said meant it was a town laid out by pinch penny bankers. And of course, the winters were frozen and tireless, and the wind hurtled down out of the north like a freight train, and the loss of light would have made anybody demoralized, even the most optimistic of souls. In truth, though, Berner and I never thought of ourselves as being from anywhere in particular. Each time our family moved to a new place, any of the far-flung locales, and settled ourselves into a rented house, and our father put on his pressed blue uniform and drove off to work at some base, and my mother commenced a new teaching position, Berner and I would try to think that this was where we'd say we were from, if anybody asked. We practiced saying the words to each other on our way to whatever our new school was each time. Hello, we're from Biloxi, Mississippi. Hello, I'm from Oscoda. It's way up in Michigan. Hello, I live in Victorville. I tried to learn the basic things the other boys knew and to talk the way they talked, pick up the slang expressions, walk around as though I felt confident being there and couldn't be surprised. Berner did the same. Then we'd move away to some other place, and Berner and I would try to get situated all over again. This kind of growing up, I know, can leave you either cast out and adrift, or it can encourage you to be malleable and dedicated to adjusting, the thing my mother disapproved of, since she didn't do it and held out for herself some notion of a different future, more like the one she'd imagined before she met our father. We, my sister and I, were small players in a drama she saw to be relentlessly unfolding. As a result, what I began to care greatly about was school, which was the continual thread in life besides my parents and my sister. I never wanted school to be over. I'd spend as much time inside school as I could, poring over books we were given, being around the teachers, breathing in the school odors, which were the same everywhere and like no other. Knowing things became important to me, no matter what they were. Our mother knew things and appreciated them. I wanted to be like her in that way, since I could keep the things I knew, and they would characterize me as being well-rounded and promising, characteristics that were important to me. No matter if I didn't belong in any of those places, I did belong in their schools. I was good at English and history and science and math, subjects my mother was also good at. Each time we picked up and moved, the only fact of life that made moving frightening was that for some reason I wouldn't be allowed to return to school, or I would miss crucial knowledge that could assure my future and was obtainable nowhere else, or that we'd go to some new place where there would be no school for me at all. Guam was once discussed. I feared I'd end up knowing nothing, have nothing to rely on that could distinguish me. I'm sure it was all an inheritance from my mother's feelings of an unrewarded life, though it may also have been that our parents, aswirl in the thickening confusion of their own young lives, not being made for each other, probably not physically desiring each other as they briefly had, becoming gradually only satellites of each other, and coming eventually to resent one another without completely realizing it. They didn't offer my sister and me enough to hold on to, which is what parents are supposed to do. However, blaming your parents for your life's difficulties finally leads nowhere. Well, that's enough to read about that. I would read longer, but the next passage just doesn't end for a long time, and then by this time you'd all be nodding off and thinking to yourself, God, is it almost 6? Cocktail hour? I don't know. Give you some let up. If anybody had a question, I'd be happy to try to answer it if I can. Yes, sir, please.
Where did you come up with the title of your book?
It was the title that I gave those 11 pages back in 1989, and I think I came up with the title for a couple of, well, maybe for more than a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, it seemed instinctively to be the title of what I was writing there. It was about a little boy who was taken against his will from Montana across the border into Saskatchewan, and so it had that as its pertinence to the action. I have a real love affair with Canada, and so every time I go to Canada, I feel better. And I wanted to try to engage or put into play that, for me, inexplicable feeling that I had about leaving America. I mean, I'm a patriotic American, and I don't necessarily think that Canada's better, except on some days. But I just thought, well, this is a feeling I have, and when you're lucky enough to have a feeling that you notice like that, and it seems persistent and not really explicable, you want to put it in play to see how it invites language to enact it in some way. So that was another reason. I also just liked the word. A lot of times people write novels and that have this or that or something else as their principal concerns, and that often owes to the fact that they like a certain word that they want to see on the page many times. And Canada was a word that I always liked to see on the page. It's a dactyl, for one thing, that da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I liked that sound. I liked all the short A sounds, and I liked the slightly different consonantal sounds. So I thought, well, if I call my novel, my story Canada, I'll see it a lot. And the reader will see it a lot. So that's the sort of congeries of things that caused me to. And believe me, I had a lot of what I guess in the modern parlance they call pushback from almost everybody who had anything to do with this book. They said, nobody will read a book called Canada. Americans think Canada is boring and like watching grass grow. And I said, no. I said, my goal in writing this book is to renew the whole conception of what Canada is about. And so I stuck to my guns. I mean, you should never, as a writer, young or old, ever let anybody talk you out of your title. You know, I did that once, and I've lived to regret it. Yes, sir.
Is the title the reason you stuck the papers in the freezer?
There's a little Canada up there in my. No, that wasn't the reason. I put it in the freezer because I think my mother always put stuff in the freezer because my mother was from Northwest Arkansas, and they lived in little wooden houses with cook stoves, and they were always afraid the house would burn. And so they stuck things in the refrigerator in the coal box because they thought that would be the last thing to burn if the house burned. And also, Christina and I have creatures. We have dogs and cats, and you don't know the number of things in the house. Well, you all do if you have dogs. You know, Christina always says, if you live with dogs, you don't live good. They're bad ruiners, you know. You leave something lying around, they get it and ruin it. So I stuck it in the freezer so they wouldn't get it. And then I always knew where it was. Yes, ma'am. Please.
Would you be kind enough to share a little of the path from the 8-year-old in Jackson, Mississippi, to the
to this moment in Darien?
Just what made you turn to the love affair with putting thoughts down on paper before you put them in the freezer?
Sure, and of course that you know, when you start trying to be a writer, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know quite why you're doing it. Everything I could tell you about it is something that I figured out in retrospect. But you know, I grew up, as I said before, in the town where there was Eudora Welty, and Faulkner was alive until 19. You know, this is the 50th anniversary of Faulkner's death now. Well, he was alive until I was in college. So in the air in Mississippi was literature. And not just the love of reading, which I didn't have, because I just didn't have it. I didn't have a love of reading. But I have a kind of awareness of writing apart from reading. And that's so important because it grants to anybody who's aware of it a sense of permission that you can deviate from being a lawyer, which I did do, deviate from being a lawyer. Or you can deviate from any of the professions or any profession at all to go into that sort of nowhere route of being a writer. But here was Eudora over there on Pinehurst Street being a writer. And that meant a huge amount in a town like very churchy, bigoted, narrow, kind of awful place, which Jackson was and is. So that was important. I was dyslexic, and I am dyslexic, and so I was very slow to learn to read. And I didn't really fully come to be able to realize that I had to read until I was about 18 or 19. And at that point, I began to read very slowly, but patiently and concertedly, really, because I just had to, you know, when you're dyslexic, you just have to read slowly if you read at all. And what that admitted me to, that slow reading pace, was all of those qualities in language that are non-cognitive, which is to say, how words look on the page, how many syllables they have, how many long A's and short A's and glottals and fricatives and schwa-e's. So that all became part of what reading was for me. And so that made words and writing attractive to me. But probably the most important thing was that the first serious novel I ever can remember reading, it was either Lolita, which I read because I thought it was a sex book, which it is, or it was Absalom. I can't remember, but I had grown up in Mississippi, sort of feeling what probably a lot of Mississippians feel, which is a sense of sort of free-floating angst about what life is like. And people were constantly telling you in Mississippi, this is great. This is a wonderful place. This is the South. And my experience was that it was not so great. That there was something was left undone. Something, racism was rife. And all of these things did not contribute to a sense that I thought the South was great. But then when I read Absalom, I understood that not only Absalom was it about life, and took me back to life in a refreshed and renewed way, which meant to me that not only was literature important, but life was important, because here was this whole book about it. But it also completed something in me that had been up to that point incomplete, as I said, which was it added an extra beat to my life. That literature just simply said, life is more important than you know, even if it's not good in Mississippi. And literature itself is a way to come back to life in a way that is renewing. And so that, I think, more than anything, the wish to do something with language which I liked, which would maybe imitate what great writing had done, do for others what writing did for me, was the thing that sort of made the difference. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Any other manuscripts in the freezer?
Yes. Yeah, quite a few, actually. 4 or 5 at least, and I'm writing a long Frank Bascom short story right now, which is going to be about 20,000 words. So I haven't been bone idle, although I don't know how in a year when you publish a book, in a book that does pretty well, like this book has, I don't know how you get anything done, but somehow I've managed to do it. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Your love of words shows, and but I think when in the beginning and you ended right after that, your statement in the book about the mathematical calculation, and if you make a mistake when you start the calculation, everything that follows is a mistake, was, I think, one of the most brilliant plot definitions, because I find as I'm reading the book, I would think, oh, well, of course that happens, because the original calculation was off. And how it carried into Dell's life, and how he proceeded, but Dell was so great at redefining himself, remaking himself, and then becoming someone who provides for kids what needed to be provided for him, was such a terrific line to follow through the book. Makes it a fantastic discussion book.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it's a really good discussion book. But I really enjoyed Dell and how he not only grew up, but evolved.
Well, that notion about, and thank you, that notion about making a mistake early on before you even knew a mistake was a mistake, and then having that radiate out into everything in your life and making everything else in your life slightly off, slightly a mistake too, in a way that you can't reach back and repair. It's just one of those preoccupying sort of myths in my life. I mean, that's the thing that I'm always suffering under. That I have made a mistake someplace which can no longer, because there's so much time has gone by, repair. It makes me sort of obsessive compulsive about certain sorts of things. But when you know that you have that kind of mental preoccupation, you can write against it. There's a line that Seamus says in his Seamusini says in his Nobel address, in which sometimes you just have to go against your own judgment as a writer. And for me, that makes sense, although it's never fun to do that, because you like to go with your best judgment. But I think that in a way, this book sort of tries to abrogate the sort of finality of whether or not that is a crippling mistake or as a crippling way to see your life. And what Dell does is, in fact, renew himself, even though you could say that his life had been broken at the beginning and everything radiated out, broken all the way. He manages to renew his life against that force. Yes, ma'am.
I'm also from the South, and I used to put my caterpillars in the freezer
Oh,
And
poor
then they would take them
caterpillars.
out, throw them out, and then play with them.
Were they still alive?
Not now.
No, not now, but were they alive when you took them out and played with them?
Yes, they would thaw out, and they would just...
See, this is why people don't like people from the South. People in New England...
I would do it in a art box also, and I would have to take across, and they would have to do these little acrobats go on the stretch.
You know, when Henry Adams, in The Education of Henry Adams, talks about what a sort of a nitwit light horse Harry Lee was, because he'd gone to the, he'd known Harry Lee, I guess, at Harvard, and he just found Harry Lee to be an idiot. But they don't understand this.
The other thing I wanted to say is that you have such wonderful, colorful descriptions of the different characters, and I was wondering if that was a collage of people in your town that you just put together.
Probably, it is certainly a collage, but I don't think it's a collage from any particular location or piece of my life. It's interesting to me that you would say that, because I just wrote a little essay for a newspaper in Ireland, which asked me to write about the thing I thought I did least well. And I think that the thing I do least well is describe people. And I hope I'm wrong, but then you're making me think maybe I'm right as well. But anyway, you know, every writer thinks that he or she has certain strengths, and you try to get as many of those strengths in your book as you possibly can, and then you kind of wait sort of apprehensively to the moment when you have to do the thing you're least good at. And I always think I'm least good at writing descriptions of people, and I have all kinds of cheating ways of doing it. So it makes me happy, but I am certainly not trying ever to describe one person, and I'm just putting bits of descriptive prose together for reasons that have less to do with their referential qualities, that is to say, how they refer and make you think of someone, than what sentences they're made up of, what words they contain. Because readers are quite permissive about that. If the sentences are good sentences, readers will permit you to do all kinds of things that they wouldn't otherwise. So I mean, it rewards hard work in a sense, in that way. Yes, ma'am.
You're teaching at Columbia?
Yes, ma'am.
What are you teaching?
Well, I teach a literature course in the College of the Arts, and it's a course for writers in the MFA program. But you know, in an MFA program, everybody's preoccupied with their work, and they're in workshops, and they're just thinking all the time about me. And so what I think is they need to read. And so I put them through a course of reading. And we're reading Henry James's prefaces in The Art of the Novel. And we're reading Emerson's essay on character. We're reading William Gass's essay on character. We're reading Eudora's essay, which is not actually very good, about sense of place, called Sense of Place in Fiction. And we read just a whole lot of things. Basically, the idea is to think about what are the formal features of a piece of fiction, and take them out of the context in which you find them within an individual story, and to talk about them, all as a way of trying to encourage people to take some sort of command of their own sentences, by trying to say to them fundamentally, you know, here was Chekhov, and here was Faulkner, and here was Welty. You're doing exactly what they're doing. There's no difference between you and them. And then writers need to know that, I believe. We can revere writers, and that's fine through the agency of their work. But all writers who are trying to be writers today are doing exactly what Chekhov did in the middle of the 19th century. We need to know that. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk about your note-taking process, sort of, you know, you said you kept writing notes and putting them in the freezer over those many years, and sort of what is it that you hit you, and how does that work when it hits you, and you make a little note about it?
Well, what hits me really are just, you know, James said a writer is a person who should be something upon whom nothing is lost. And so for me, I just write down everything that seems interesting to me, either something out of the newspaper, a story, or a piece of dialogue that I hear someone say that I think is funny, or a word that I like, again, that I want to get into a story. I mean, for me, as was implied before, writing stories which are linear in nature are, for me, sort of more like collages, so that I put things together. You know, Ruskin says composition is the arrangement of unequal things. And for me, I'm always trying to put unequal things together in that way. So it's entirely promiscuous, what will interest me. It would be something that wouldn't even grasp your notice, or it would be something that you would obviously think a writer should pay attention to. But for me, I can never know. I just keep my notebook. I just write it down religiously because it reminds me of what my vocation is. It's with me all the time except now. No offense. I'm always afraid I'm going to lose it. So, and I have lost one or two in my life, which seem to me to be painful. So, a couple more. Is that what you said? Yes, sir, please.
You mentioned earlier that Bell in the last novel renewed himself. Is renew the same as redemption, or how does redemption enter into your calculation?
Well, redemption has a little fuzz of religion about it. You know, there's a line of F.R. Leavis, which I hold to. I mean, everybody, I think, ought to, if somebody said to anybody in this room, what is your definition of literature? You ought to be able to say something that makes sense to you. And Leavis's definition is literature is the supreme means by which we renew our sensuous and emotional life and learn a new awareness. And so for me, that sense of renewing your sensuous and emotional life, you could say it redeems it, but more, I would think, in an entirely secular way, renew or redeem means to go from a story back to life in a way that makes life seem more worth living. That even though it doesn't solve its problems, even though it doesn't lie about it, even though it tells the truth, but it takes you back to life and think to yourself, well, this is not all a loss, is it? So in that way, I suppose. And that comes, in that sense of renewal comes from all kinds of sources. It comes from realizing that the language that you use every day thoughtlessly can in fact be interesting. That you can take command over it in a way different from how you did. It can talk, you know, philosophically, like a book like The Movie Goer by Walker Percy talks philosophically about life. So you can come from a literary text back to life and be renewed in all kinds of ways. So redeeming, I'm okay with redeeming as long as we keep it in the secular reign, because I don't have a faith of the other kind. One more question, please, sir.
If you have time to read now, what do you enjoy reading?
Well, I read fiction because there's a lot of, well, put it differently, there is really good fiction being written in America now. There's not a lot of it, but probably there was never a lot of it. But I read a lot of fiction because I find things when I encounter them that I can't do, that seems to me to be better than I am. In a perverse way, I find that encouraging. I think to myself, well, there's something else I have to learn, something else I have to do. You don't ever get too old to think that you can do something better than you do it. I mean, the whole progressive notion of being a novelist is that you have to try to get better at what you do. And one of the ways you get better at what you do is to read a book like James Salter's new novel, which is going to be published in a couple of months, called All That Is. I just read that book. It's much spectacular. And so I read a lot of novels. Not enough nonfiction, but I do my best there. Thank you all very much.